I'm done, and I'm going to turn it over to Blardo, who's going to explain what all of this awesome tech is.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get out of this. And let's get back here. All right, so for those who aren't familiar or didn't read the topic, I call this talk Multirotor Madness, and I'm going to go and be completely transparent. This isn't really a talk. This is ultimately an opportunity to try and convince a whole bunch of people in this room that they think this is just as cool as I do and want to hang out, talk about it, build cool stuff, and perhaps get to maybe even racing these things. So coming soon to a slide deck near you after this talk. So who am I? My name's Anthony Blardo. I'm a full-time engineer at Bellhops. We work out of the Lamppost Group building for now, getting ready to move to Warehouse Row. Pretty pumped. You can find me on Twitter at APBlardo, wherein I usually retweet cute pictures and stuff. So let's start with one of the elephants in the room. Everyone's probably seen this video, but this is an expensive hobby, and things break. This is not an uncommon scenario if you're building a camera platform. So let's begin there. This guy fortunately caught it, and then to quote one of my coworkers from yesterday, no, really, it's like you're setting money on fire. Heads up, if you get into the racing side of this hobby, it can be very, very, very costly, but that's okay. Follow-up point, it looks really complicated. When you start getting into custom builds and some of the more advanced tech that comes with these things, you can be a little bit overwhelmed, and to be completely honest, I still am. I don't have a very good idea of how all of the electronics work. The video transmission parts of a lot of this stuff are still a little bit arcane, but fortunately, there's a huge community of people who are willing to help. And the other thing is, when you get to a certain point, it's completely and totally worth all of the hassle that you go through. So this is a quick video, or a GIF of some folks doing some FPV racing flights. So I'll go ahead and get immediately into some of the stuff that's going on up here. So up here, there's a whole bunch of parts that are going to end up being useful. So I'm going to pass these around so people can kind of handle stuff. First things first, one of the core tenets of a multi-rotor aircraft is that you have to have something called a flight controller. So your flight controller, which is this tiny little piece of equipment, typically comes unsoldered, or you can buy them soldered, up to you. This piece is what's responsible for taking input from your transmitter, which would be this very large, oversized, scary-looking thing here, and turns it into an electronic impulse that spins a motor. So what do 250 FPV frame motors look like?
What does 250 FPV stand for?
All right, so this, sorry, I'll turn it back on in a second. This is a standard size 250, is what you'll hear it referred to as, FPV multi-rotor frame. This one specifically is a ZMR body, purchased online for not a whole lot. I'll have links and show some of the options for buying this stuff in just a moment. But so 250 millimeters means that's the distance from arm to arm. So multi-rotor aircraft come in a variety of sizes. You can start at all the way down at micro-size stuff. For reference, this is a Blade Nano QX frame. You can pick these up at Hobbytown USA, up by the mall. You can pick it up in a bind and fly package, which means that you have to have a third-party transmitter, one you own yourself, or you can pick them up in ready-to-fly packages. What that means is they come with their own transmitter. They come with all of the stuff you could possibly need to get it up in the air and moving. So worth noting, the bind and fly and ready-to-fly versions of this are roughly $60 to $70. They're not terribly expensive, and to give you an idea of the kind of performance you can expect out of this, I'll just go ahead and actually put it in the air real quick. So when you turn it on, there's a gyroscope inside of it that automatically levels to try and keep track of where you're at. Then it sends out a 5.2 gigahertz DSMX signal, which you try and bind to on your transmitter. So when I go, oh, of course this happens. There we go. I had a throttle cut on. So the good news is this stuff is really not hard to fly. I got the gyro a little off balance when I spun it up, but so this is really where I would recommend most folks start in this hobby. It's not doing anything super fancy, not amazingly fast, not super aerobatic, but it does have a second flight mode, which lets you do a lot more aerobatics, but is also substantially harder to control. And my gyro is a little off balance, which is why it's flying off to the edge. So, all right, so there's some of the pieces that have gone around. To give you an idea, again, each of these little micro aircraft are functioning on the same principles. You can see on the one that doesn't have the canopy on top of it up here, it's a little hard to see because it's underneath a camera and some other stuff, but there's a little flight controller board. You can throw this on another frame. So for instance, here's a replacement carbon fiber frame for that Nano QX. These parts are all readily available, not expensive. I believe this frame costs $15 maybe. So this hobby seems a little bit intimidating to get into, a little bit crazy. Really, truly is not. But when I get to the reason that I find it compelling, it boils down to this little thing right here. So we've got a camera, right? Everyone's seen one of these. But these are really small. And then when you look at the front of this frame, you'll notice there's a camera mounting bracket here. So once wired and you introduce the camera to the front of the frame, suddenly you end up with something a little bit more interesting. You have the option to sit in your chair and throw a pair of goggles on. And you don't actually have to move. You don't have to watch your frame. You don't have to keep line of sight to the thing you're working with. All you have to do is sit down, pair it to the camera, and watch it go. And to illustrate that, this also has video out, which is kind of an interesting idea. So let's do this on this side. Thank you. If I don't end up with all of those parts back, I will be a little sad. Let's see. Extra battery. So, this one you saw come off the ground. Now let's get a look at what FPV flight looks like. Audio not required. All right, so let's switch the source here. This should just be video. It is on. So the way that it works should be that you just have to plug it in. But if this won't allow me, that would be truly unfortunate. I did not test this before, for reference. Oh no, it won't let me output video this way. Well, that shoots a hole in one of the core tenets of this. So what I'm going to actually do instead is anyone who wants to actually see what this looks like, after I'm done speaking, which will just be another couple of minutes, I'll have you come over and I'll actually have this aircraft in the air with the goggles going. So anyone who's interested in seeing what FPV flight feels like, I'll have a demo of that up and ready to go. So getting back to some of the things that are attached to these, you'll notice that this transmitter is very large, but it also comes with a receiver. So any receiver can be bound to essentially any radio frequency that the DSM spectrum uses. That's what the spectrum transmitters use. That's what the by and large majority of the parts and pieces use for this stuff. I apologize for having to jump back and forth so frequently. So this is a video of one of the best flyers in the world. We'll show real FPV. This is what got me interested. And hopefully it does the same. So this is just a 30-second flight at 60 frames per second of one of the best pilots in the world. Goes by the name of Sharpu. So this if you take these kinds of videos and these kinds of perspectives into consideration, and you think about what's available in Chattanooga, there's tons of abandoned buildings in this city. There's tons of wooded areas out around us. There are all kinds of interesting opportunities for obstacle courses. And yes, he did smash into another drone in the air. Unfortunately, yeah, and so we'll go ahead and just throw up some footage of some folks racing so we have something in the background while I speak. I want Through the Cracks by Sharpoo FPV. Of course, it's not on his main page anymore. Yeah, 60 frames per second is pretty crazy. Typically, you can expect frame rates closer to 25 frames per second through the headsets. It's also worth noting that this here is produced by a company called Fat Shark. They are now a partner with Horizon Hobby, who again is a primary stock point inside of Hobbytown USA. This kit here runs about 350, comes with the camera that is on this frame. So for reference, with this frame and an FPV kit, out the door is round about $400. So it's not as expensive as everyone thinks, and I'll show you why there's this misconception that it's incredibly expensive all the time. So to come off of this is the one everyone knows. This is the DJI Phantom. This is a camera platform. This is fundamentally different from these 250 or 400 sized aerobatic frames. The difference is primarily that this has a gimbal attached to it, which means that you have a free-floating camera underneath it. You have two separate controls, or you can attach a head tracking headset. Most of the ones that Fat Shark makes also have head tracking attached to them now. So you can, in fact, move your head left and right and watch the gimbal swivel and actually reflect the changes. This drone, say again? The Oculus Rift is slowly but surely gaining support across the community to empower this. In fact, there are also a couple of Arduino projects for flight controllers that integrate Oculus functionality. There are also a couple of open Android platforms that do this. And in fact, thank you for that, this company, 3D Robotics, they just recently raised a boatload of money, but they released this drone called the Iris Plus. This is totally driven from Android. All of their integrations with it, it will do waypoint flight, it will do GPS flights, it will keep track of all of its telemetry, it will show you where it's traveled, how fast it went, how high it went. All of that information is recorded onto the flight controller and then is readable out through Android systems. This, again, when you start stacking options onto it, can be a little bit pricey, roughly in the same cost range as the DJI Phantom stuff. Then, again, the Nano QX, which is realistically my recommendation for an intro to anyone who's trying to get into this hobby and has no context for how 3D flight feels or no idea of orientation. That will be your largest challenge when you begin flying. Being able to understand where the front of the aircraft is and how pitch and yaw are going to adjust based on where you're at. These are inexpensive. If they break, it's not that bad. In fact, this one here, I have Gorilla Tape wrapped around one of the arms because I shattered it the other day. So repairs are not always expensive. You can really get by with what you've got. The notable caveat to that is you probably need to learn how to solder very quickly. This hobby will force you to sit down with small electronics and learn how they work very, very, very quickly. For instance, this 250 frame up here, I ended up having to actually solder on all of the bullet connectors on all of these, heat shrink them myself. We'll have to wire down to the power distribution board on the new frame myself. So if you want to build from scratch, know that that is a big part of this hobby. But it's also worth noting that if you are interested in getting into this hobby without spending a bunch of money, or without spending time soldering, you can do that through companies that are in this space. So this is a group out of Florida called Get FPV. They sell ready-to-fly kits that come with everything you can possibly need. Pre-wired, frame pre-assembled, ship it to your door, open it up, bind it, go. These are a little bit more costly because you're paying for the labor, but it's actually not a bad intro to the system. If you're looking for something in this size and you don't feel that you have the patience to sit down and solder yourself, just know that when it comes time to repair it, that could be a problem. The other option, which is what I did, and this is in fact the kit that is sitting up here on the front of the desk. This is FPV Model. They're a company based out of China, but they sell parts and pieces from all kinds of different manufacturers. This is the almost ready to fly kit, which is essentially what it sounds like. It's just a bundle of parts. You put it together, add a receiver, add a transmitter, add FPV goggles if you're into that sort of thing, or whatever type of output information you would like, and go nuts. So for reference, this tiny little piece of equipment right here, this is a video transmitter. All you do is run 2 wires, one out to the camera, one out to power, and then it has a video transmission. That's all it takes to get this stuff in the air, wired together, and working. So again, selfishly, I really, really, really want to get people into this hobby. And so here's another great option to do that. The Hubsan X4s, these are itty bitty, like Pico-sized copters that are just aerobatic enough to be entertaining, you know, not really gonna break the bank if you shatter one. I believe Chris has killed one of these already. So these are all great options to get into this hobby, and hopefully with some insight and some ideas, it doesn't seem that intimidating. There's more to this when it gets to tuning flight controllers, when it gets to understanding how to set up your transmitter so that your throttle curves are accurate. But I'm not going to dive way down into the nerdy engineering side of this stuff, just because that's better left for instance, a Carbon 5 Hack Night, where I'm going to start showing up and bringing equipment that I'm working on pretty routinely. So I encourage some folks here to join me in doing that. If you're interested, please hit me up. And like I said, if you want to see what it feels like to actually have the goggles on and have an aircraft in the air, I'll be demoing that in just a couple of moments. So if you have questions, other things that you would like to hear about.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What about last year when the FAA banned FPV for UA?
So what ended up happening was the Federal Aviation Administration got a little bit uppity because there were a couple of people who hit actual aircraft with their drones. Not kidding, they actually struck airliners. That has happened multiple times. So what ended up occurring was they just released a set of regulations a couple of weeks ago that changed what you need to do if you want to be a commercial drone operator. Those laws now state that you need an operator's license and you need to prove that you're trained to acquire that license. You don't have to pre-register flight plans like you do with any standard aircraft, but those laws only apply if you're doing commercial operations. So for instance, if you're doing real estate photography is probably the most common use case now, or just aerial photography in general. Those people now do need to certify and do need to have a license to get paid to operate their drones. For folks like myself who are just hobbyists, it's not a big deal. As long as you fly in line of sight, they use a term called a safe flight plan, which is sort of ambiguous intentionally. If they find that you hit something hard and you cause a lot of damage, they'll probably get real mad at you. But that is a case-by-case consideration, not a broad spectrum ban. The other thing you have to be careful about is there are FCC certified versions of FPV transmission kits. The difference there is the spectrum on which it operates. FCC certified ones are better for commercial operation, again, because now you need a license to do that. Chris?
It's worth noting, for a lot of us who are getting into this hobby, that the rules are still really ambiguous.
Yes.
And no one has really come out and said, here's the hard and fast on all this stuff. So it's up to us, for those of us who are really getting into it, to realize that we're stewards of it, and rules are going to be created based on how we do it. So if we do something stupid, there's going to be a law about it. So,
it's a very good point, and in fact, it's already happened.
Yeah, I mean, if you start flying it and doing crazy stuff, we want to have fun, but we also have to realize that, yeah, we're potentially going to dictate how laws work about this stuff. So let's be a little bit mindful of that. Stuff like just keeping logs and keeping, I flew this many hours today or whatever. That's not a bad idea because there could come a time when that is important. So just something to think about.
There's a friend at Cover 5's this guy Ariel who's doing something called Tide Mapper. It's like waves for drones. So
Oh, cool.
it's the ability to track waypoints from basically 4 feet to 400 feet. It's mapping out people that are hobbyists, drone hobbyists. So if you are interested, they're trying to deal with
Very cool. And so it's worth noting that while we start this as kind of a hobby, and for instance, like I said, myself and Bentley over here is the other person who I know is really getting into this. We want to start a racing league because that would be a lot of fun. But there's also tons of opportunities for just aerial photography. Maybe if you wanted to do some exploration around in some of the hiking areas, the trails around here, there's some great footage available on YouTube of people flying some very high quality camera platforms up, and there are just gorgeous views in town. So as long as you're responsible with your flights, it's not a huge problem with regulation. I don't think it will continue to be. Again, like Chris mentioned, just be good stewards of your hobby. I mean, in the same way that programmers, if you decide you want to write nothing but black hat code, that's going to end poorly. Don't do those things. But then the last point that I want to make is that batteries for these sorts of things come with a whole bunch of warnings. They are not lithium-ion batteries, they are lithium polymer batteries, which means that they are more subject to rupturing, catching fire, exploding, yada yada, blah, blah, blah. And you can also buy them in multiple cell structures, which also determines how volatile they are. Legitimately. When you buy lithium polymer batteries, it is a good idea to find safe places to store them, like LiPo bags. They sell them. Also make sure that you buy a full regulated charger and that you buy all of the appropriate equipment to do this safely. Again, these little ones are toys, and it's very easy to see sort of how they work, and you know, you're not going to hurt yourself too bad using an itty-bitty plastic prop. When you step up to the 250 millimeter and bigger sizes, be aware that there are very, very serious hazards in doing so. They are no longer a toy at that point. By now you've achieved an actual hobby with an aircraft that will move at 100 miles an hour, so be aware that that's a very real danger. Rotors on when you're not paying attention will open you quite wide up and require stitches. I've seen very serious injuries from these things. So on the spirit of it can be dangerous, it's also a ton of fun, and hopefully some folks want to come over and see what it feels like to have the goggles on. So thank you very much for your time, and oh, sorry, hold on. I had a question. I missed a question. I actually don't know. I think that there's a minimum value assignable before insurance will cover them, which you could do. I'm sure you could insure, for instance, a DJI Phantom because they're $1,000 plus.
More like it used to show up crashing someone's car, they sue before.
I would assume so. You probably, your personal liability insurance, whatever carrier that's through, I imagine would take into account some of those sorts of things.
Blardo's not a lawyer.
That's correct. I am not a legal, I cannot give legal advice.
This is not legal advice.
Thank you.
Nor does Chattanooga Developers Association.
Nice catch.
I was going to add not a legal advice, a little bit of personal liability insurance, if you do it right, will offset your auto insurance and house insurance and other things, and makes it to where when you do something stupid, you're covered.
Absolutely.
Under a normal person, you're not. But talk to your insurance agent about it, because if your personal life is a little complex, it makes everything else cheaper.
And in fact, I do the same thing through State Farm. I deal with an agent all the time. It's very good advice. If you're doing stuff like this that involves potentially dropping things that weigh 100 pounds on people's cars, you should probably insure yourself against damages. So, like I said, I think that's everything that I've got. Other questions?
What's battery life like, and then once you start adding video to that?
Okay, so that's actually a really good question. Typical flight times, depending on the configurations, range between 4 to 6 minutes for most things. You can build platforms that fly longer than that, but it's going to cost you a lot more money, and you're encountering the same problem that electric vehicles on the ground are starting to encounter, which is batteries weigh a lot, and as you increase weight, you need more of them to keep getting up. So on average, I would say don't expect more than like 7 to 10 minutes at best case out of most frames. The exception to that being some of those very large camera platforms. You can get 15, 20 minutes out of some of that stuff, but be aware that the reason that GIF of the guy falling into the water is that his battery just died. That is very common. It's also worth noting that when you build one yourself, you need a battery buzzer on the frame, otherwise you're going to lose it. When your LiPo gets low, if you over discharge it, it's very difficult to recharge those things, and it's very hard to know when your battery's dying, but you can wire into the circuit a buzzer that will alert you that the battery is going dead. So those are also very, very good ideas. And again, simple circuitry, not a huge deal. So the wiring diagram that I showed earlier is in fact all that it means to wire one of these things. So I think that's...
What's the recharge time
I usually see, depending on the size of the battery and how many cells it is, 45 minutes to an hour, maybe a little longer than that. It's not awful, but it's not equivalent to your flight times by a bunch. So for instance, for the little Nano QXs, they're 150 milliamp lithium polymers. I have 4 of them on hand, so I can just quick rotate. By the time the first one's done, I have enough to keep flying. The only thing you have to pay attention to when you start rotating batteries like that is whether your motors are overheating. So just be careful about those sorts of things. Again, there's a lot of gotchas, a lot of caveats, but it is totally worth everything that you have to go through. The first time you go in an FPV kit and just feel what it feels like to, I don't know. To me, it feels like you're sitting in a pod racer, if you've ever seen episode 1. It's this unreal feeling that you're not putting your life in danger by doing it, which is the only way you can get these sensations otherwise. If you're an adrenaline junkie, this is a great way to get that fix without putting yourself in danger. So that's something that I got into. Yes?
I know I got into this hobby a little bit, and YouTube channel Flight Test is really helpful.
Yes.
Is there any channel or other channels that you might recommend?
Not really. They're kind of where I default to. Tested is also a pretty good place to go. They offer some drone stuff in there. DroneDudes.com is also a good resource for some of this information. And then really just Google around a little bit. Say again? Yeah, the subreddit r/Multicopter is where I go for most of my information these days. Huge active community. Worth noting, most of this stuff has caught on in Europe by now. It's just slowly starting to make its way into the US. Most of the stuff that you order online is going to come from China. There are a couple of companies starting to open up in Florida, which I've noticed, like all the Sarasota area for some reason. There's like 3 or 4 down there, but slowly but surely availability of parts is getting better in the United States, so you're not waiting 3 weeks for shipping anymore. Just be aware that it can be a pain. Yes?
Anybody successfully doing solar?
I have not yet seen anyone do solar-powered drones yet, but I imagine that you could probably pull it off at a small scale. And then just figure out how to efficiently scale it up. It's certainly doable, but I haven't seen great versions of it yet. Yes. So it's worth... Yeah. Well, so it's worth noting that the primary difference between a single prop aircraft and the multi-rotor aircraft is it requires substantially more power to move one of these because you have 4 electronic speed controllers and 4 motors versus a single in the other. So your flight times are substantially lower there as well. Your weight is higher. So just be aware, aerobatics, not quite as good as an aircraft if that's what you're into. Fixed wing aircrafts are pretty good for that kind of thing. And again, I cannot plug our local hobby town enough. They're actually going to assist me in getting a league going, start distributing information and materials there. So thanks to them for that. And I think that's everything that I've got to say. So if anybody has any questions, hit me up after this, and thank you very much.